Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your ticker guy coming at you from wonderful Niceville, Florida. If you're wondering where the other copy of this video went, I erased it. So don't accuse YouTube of censoring me. They're not censoring anything. I found an error in my chart work, and I think it's very important to present accurate information to everybody. So when I make a mistake, I go back and fix it. And guess what? I made a mistake. We have $53 trillion outstanding in debt right now in the financial system. That is the debt that the Federal Reserve counts, not the $110 trillion that I believed. But the chart, when it was reworked, showed some rather frightening things. Let's go ahead and bring this up. I'm going to first bring up the larger scale chart here. This is the one in the 1980s. This has all the different subdivisions on it. The Fed had indicated some areas that actually overlapped, and it was very difficult to figure out because the subdivided areas didn't add up. Ain't that nice? So they have this miscellaneous bucket apparently out there that isn't in one of their columns. That was the reason for the error. Now you know what happened. Here is the corrected information. But when you look at this, you'll see that there's a little bit of a problem here, folks. It isn't just consumers that have hit the wall. It's also private businesses and state and local governments. You'll notice that the credit demand across those three areas, everything except the federal government and financial bets, that is credit for financial activities, has fallen off a cliff or flatlined, whereas those two areas have expanded dramatically in an attempt to keep up the charade. That's a problem. I want to bring up the debt to GDP numbers as well. I added another area to this, and that is the percentage of debt to GDP. We're going to start with the big chart that goes all the way back to the 1950s, and you can see that we had a very stable situation up until about the mid-1980s, when all of a sudden the debt to GDP ratio started to take off. Now folks, remember, we had low interest rates during the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, and we had moderately high interest rates during the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. We also had extremely low interest rates during the 1950s, 1960s as well. There was only that one period when Jimmy Carter was in office and Paul Volcker raised rates dramatically that we saw rates really, really rocket to the moon. All right, so before you get into this thing about how very low rates are a new phenomenon and we can just hold them down here and that allows these higher ratios, you need to ask yourself why those higher ratios didn't exist during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. The answer is because they're unsustainable and we didn't have games being played in the financial system, all of which started with the deregulation. But isn't this exactly what happened in the 1920s? Indeed it is. And yet, during the depths of the Depression, we only got to 235% of GDP for outstanding debt in the system. When we got past there in 2000. So what really went on here, folks? Let's go back to the chart that I pulled up a few days ago. It's kind of obvious. In 2000, we saw a fall off in consumer per capita credit demand. The result of this was that Greenspan went nuts. He cranked open the monetary spigots and he goaded both the federal government and financial industries into cranking open credit themselves. And that flowed through to households. This produced the bubble, this drove the ratios higher, but we ran into a wall. And that is the ability of private citizens and businesses to make the debt service payments. You can see the fall off here in the activity charts, both from a credit demand perspective and from an asset valuation perspective. An awful lot of that asset valuation contraction, ladies and gentlemen, was houses and still is. Now here's the question. Going back to the credit growth chart here again for a moment. How do you get the economy to start moving again? How do you get this ratio between debt and GDP back down to a reasonable level? Let's just try to get it back down to the 2000 level. How does that happen? To come from 370% down to 250, you'd have to take 50% off the debt outstanding, or you'd have to increase GDP commensurately, or some combination of the two. Yet to increase GDP dramatically, you would either have to export a great deal of more product, additional product, you'd have to boost earnings for consumers, or some combination of the two. How's that going to happen? If it doesn't happen, What is the outcome of continuing to try to pull forward demand by borrowing from the federal government and by placing ever larger bets by financial institutions on the price of commodities and equities? I think you know. The last time we tried something this stupid was just about 1.5 years ago. It didn't work, did it? What leads you to believe it will work this time? The data in these charts is not wrong, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't lie. There isn't any way to get GDP to grow again, nor to get the consumer to grow again without being able to grow consumer incomes dramatically, or bringing leverage ratios down so not so much of their money is being chewed up in interest payments. This applies to businesses as well. I wish the policymakers the best of luck in what appears to be a mathematically impossible attempt. For everyone else, make sure you have a sturdy desk to hide under. This ride could get a little rough. Have a nice day.